land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters, this land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and welcome to the Right and Left Discussion Forum. The purpose of our forum is to demonstrate that people can have different political views and still have civilized discussions. We believe that being right is not as important as the relationships that we have with our fellow citizens that enable us to share this country. Today's topic is why tough teachers get good results, or do they? Our discussion panel today, beginning on my left, is Bryan Laubaugh. Bryan is president of R&B Financial Services and member of the Medina County Republican Executive Committee. On his left is Patty Haskins, retired math teacher from Wadsworth High School and Democratic member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is our new panelist, Timothy Burns, retired elementary school principal in the Cloverleaf School System and currently manager of adult services at the Twinsburg Library. Last night we saw that our distinguished leaders in Washington, D.C. decided to operate the government for another 90 days at a huge price. And today I think that we would like to talk about possible ways that we can educate our children better so that they can shoulder the burden of our debt. Each one of them now owes about $55,000 and hopefully become better leaders than we've been. And Bryan, in recent years, the formal self-esteem programs to improve academic performance and social skills, it's gained a lot of traction in public education, but it's not without critics. The old school method of rote memorization, drilling, harsh discipline, high expectations, continued effort still have a lot of support. What do you think?
I would agree that, with one little caveat, the notion that we need harsh discipline. I think discipline in a learning environment is good. And there's a little bit of a paradox here when we start dealing with self-esteem. It would seem that if you just showered our young people, those students, with just constant attaboys, how awesome you are, you're a super kid, you're doing great, you're a winner, that they would come away with a feeling that somehow they are, but it's actually in reverse. Some of the studies that I looked at, I can't say most, but some of the studies that I looked at had a pretty good correlation between, just the way self-esteem has been taught, and then I guess maybe the way I was taught, maybe some of the panelists were taught as far as self-esteem. It wasn't something that you learned through the book or through the classroom. It's something you learned through experience, that you weren't afraid to fail. You got up, you tried again. And I think we've somehow let some things creep into our abilities to raise children. And I'm not saying it's just through the schools. I go back to an experience I had growing up. A teacher sent home a note to my father, and there was no question that the teacher was right. And no matter how much I protested that it wasn't fair, the teacher didn't understand me, that teacher was correct. That teacher was right. And I don't know if we're really getting that from the parent side today as we should. So I'm interested in hearing what the other panelists have to say, but I really think that we need to raise the bar. We need to raise the expectation for our children, the students that are involved. I kind of laughed at there was a little YouTube video that went around recently, and they were rolling out this new teaching method, Common Core, or whatever, and they talked about 6 and 6 was no longer 12. If a student answered 10, then at least they were getting close to the answer.
And you're kidding, of course.
No, it's true. It was on.
That's true.
And to me, the only thing that came to mind was what my father would say is the only thing where close counts is in horseshoes and hand grenades. So I think we can go back to some of those things. That kids need to memorize multiplication tables, the states, you know,
the
capitals, just those types of things, which I think, you know, we're just sort of getting away from.
Patty, after all of your years of teaching, I'm sure that this is something that strikes close to your heart.
Yes.
Tell us what you think.
A lot. You know, one of the things I remember quite vividly from an education course that I took, and this was after I was teaching, was the professor told us that students will work up to what your expectations are. So if your expectations and standards are high, they will work up to achieve that level. If, however, you lower those expectations and lower, for example, the difficulty of a course, students will actually work down to that level. So, you know, first of all, I think we need to maintain high expectations in the classroom, that you don't water down curriculum so that everybody gets an A. Too many people feel that everyone should get an A or you're not succeeding. We have different levels of abilities in different courses, and our level may not be an A in a particular course. That doesn't mean we're not succeeding. That means we need to work harder and strive harder to understand that topic. Bryan mentioned rote learning. You know, I was a mathematics teacher, and I taught upper level classes, and one of my biggest problems, I had very bright children, very bright kids. 90% of the time when they were having difficulty, it had nothing to do with their creativity, their math abilities, or getting through a problem. It went back to basics. You know, for example, when we were solving fractional equations. They knew all the rules for solving a fractional equation, but they couldn't do them because they didn't have a clue how to work with a fraction. And that's part of your basics. Too much concern, I think, has been placed on understanding why things are done, and that this is to develop creativity in a classroom, as opposed to simply learning. Before I started teaching, I went to an Ohio Math Teachers Conference, and I still remember the professor from Kent State that spoke to us said, you know, in the elementary levels, you really don't need to learn why. We'll worry about that when that child gets to college. What we need to have is that strong foundation, and that means multiplication tables, certain basics that need to be taught to students. Technology has caused part of that problem, and I think technology is wonderful because you can do so many more things, especially in a mathematics classroom, because of technology. But because of that technology, in some cases, students have forgotten to use their brain. And like a muscle, it needs to be exercised. And certain things need to be memorized. The brain needs to be exercised so that you can look at a problem and say, you know, that doesn't seem like that's a reasonable answer. Some kids are literally to the point where if they got it on the calculator, it has to be right, and there's no way they could have punched the wrong numbers in. You know, it was scary in a classroom when you would say, okay, we have to take 20 times 5, and the kid would pick up a bright student would pick up a calculator to take 20 times 5, and that always scared me. You mentioned strictness of teachers. If I asked my children who their favorite teachers were, they were the ones that demanded the most from them, that had their classroom under control, and the ones that the kids then learned the most and found them to be the most valuable.
And when they walked out of the class, they had a higher level of self-esteem than when they walked in?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, we were taught not to say no. You know, there was a point where you went through this bit where you never told the kid they were wrong. You know, I would always get questions from parents because I'd have a test, and you know, the parents would say, well, why didn't you give partial credit? I mean, they did this right and they did this right, but they don't have the answer. There is a point where things are right and things are wrong, and I think that's one of them.
Ron, you've spent most of your life in the classroom, I think.
Well, not really. I'm neither an educator nor a psychologist, but I married one. My wife has a bachelor's and master's degree in elementary education with a minor in child psychology. She worked in classroom situations in elementary school, and here in Wadsworth she worked for a number of years in what was then called learning disabilities, where she would take students 101 and help them work on whatever their particular problems were.
Why don't we have Lois here instead of you?
Pardon me?
Why don't we have Lois here instead of you?
We should have. But she tells me, says one of the most important tasks she had as that learning disability tutor was the self-esteem of students. Here's a kid who might be otherwise fairly bright, but because of perhaps dyslexia, because of some other lack in their environment, in their learning abilities, were failing or below par in a particular subject or two. And to get those kids up to speed on that, to tell them that, yeah, they're working hard, they have the ability to do this, or they have the ability to get to a certain level on this, was a very important part of her job, the self-esteem. So that's an important thing. At the same time, I agree with, I believe it was Rada said, you can't just keep heaping praise on the kid. You're great, you get a trophy for participation. That doesn't work, because that's an individualized thing. Each student has to be looked at for his or her needs, and the teacher has to address that. I don't know if you have time to do all that in the classroom, but I think that's an important part of it. Rote learning, yeah, you got to get the basics. I remember you probably did. I went to a parochial school that had 2 classes in each room. We had 4 rooms in the schoolhouse, and you know, second grade was thinking 2 times 2 is 4, and I don't know what the other class was doing, but you know, people were chanting out loud, doing all this.
Yeah.
It sticks.
Yeah. Tim, newest member of our panel, but you've spent a tremendous amount of time teaching, principling, so forth. I'm sure that you've got an opinion on this topic.
Well, you know, I've actually done quite a bit of thinking just because of the topic and meeting with you. I was never a tough teacher. I was never a tough principal. I'm not a tough manager of adult public services, but it's that word tough. I'm not quite sure what that means. What I tried to do in my own world was to look at individuals and try to respond to them. And I've thought a lot about that. It's like, you know, because the teachers that I respected, the ones that I supervised, teachers, were tougher than me. And I really respected them. I really liked how they did their job. They couldn't have done their job my way, and I couldn't have done their job their way. It was inside of each teacher. So there has to be a kind of a common core of however we approach. A rote learning and memorization, learning to spell, I mean, all those things are absolutely basic. You have to have a foundation. Creative teachers come up with creative ways of doing that. But repetition works almost as well as creative ideas. But it's got to be that individual teacher responding to individual students. And that's one of the concerns I have about many things in society, is that we tend to look at the greater good for the greater number, which I mean, that's obvious, that makes sense. But I really worry about the individual person and what they lose in that kind of spectrum. I responded well to teachers that believed in me, but they didn't have to like me. I mean, I didn't have this feeling that they were my friend or that we had a relationship. They just believed that I could do this, you know, and I responded to that. That's setting high expectations. But I tended to look at it somewhat, you know, like a little bit differently. I came across an article that had 8 characteristics that students nowadays talk about that make a good teacher. And I'm not sure they're valid at all. But some of them are what we've been talking about, the high expectations and different things, but being prepared. Being prepared was, and kids can tell right away. If you don't know what you're doing, you forgot, you didn't do your lesson plans, you were lost. Fairness, that's one that is just a killer, because kids have this heightened sense of fairness. But I think they can understand an innate sense of fairness. I mean, what the teacher reacts to a whole group. So, you know, just thinking in terms of that, I look maybe perhaps more on the individual side of that thing. So.
The whole topic of self-esteem is kind of interesting because it has several different definitions. And I'm going to give you 2, but I'm also going to give you one I made up. One of them is the experience, self-esteem is the experience of feeling capable of meeting life's challenges, plus the feeling of being worthy. Now, think about that. Now, here's the one I made up. Self-esteem is having confidence in one's ability, skills, and talents to successfully respond to challenges and take advantage of opportunities. Now, that's my own. Here's one that will cause you to think. All right. Self-esteem is success divided by pretension. I'm going to say that again. Success divided by pretension.
Your pretension is very high, your self-esteem approaches 0. How about limits in mathematics here?
Here's the question that I have. To me, it's intuitively obvious that when a student feels good about themselves and they're confident in their abilities, they're going to be higher on the learning curve. They're just going to learn better. That is, to me, intuitive. It's irrefutable. But according to most studies, it's also wrong. That the idea that students will learn better if they come with a higher level of self-esteem. So the question is, where does the self-esteem come from? And that, or does the self-esteem come from achievement? I think, Brian, you implied that.
Chicken and egg situation, isn't
yes,
it?
exactly. But we've apparently the nation since sometime in the 80s has become enthralled with self-esteem programs, operating on the assumption that the self-esteem comes first and then learning comes later. A traditionalist will say, no, you've got self-esteem once you've earned it. So,
well, I think, yeah, I would agree with everyone's points here that, you know, I just look back on the experiences that I had growing up in a family where there were expectations from the children. I knew my parents loved me. My father was a retired sergeant in the Army. He ran our home. It was orderly. There was lots of things to do, but he wasn't, and my mother wasn't there constantly telling me how great the job I did when I was told to go out and mow the grass. So we've set this almost this pattern up at times to where we think that if we're trying to be our student's friend or our son or daughter's friend, that they're going to like us more, and then they'll do what we want them to do, hence they'll feel good about themselves, and they'll have self-esteem. I believe in learning from our failures. You know, you fall down, you don't pass all the tests in school. You know, I told my kids, and I continue to tell them, I really don't want you taking all the classes that you feel like you're going to get an A in. You know, you should take the difficult classes, the challenges. And if you did your very best and you walked away with a C or a B minus, and you did your best, then you learned something. And I think that's the direction we need to head in, is that we can't be afraid to, you know, have failure. You don't want to make a habit of it, but you really learn from your mistakes. And I'm sure we could talk about the mistakes that we've all made and the lessons that we've learned from that. But it seems as though in the parenting circles and some of the programs that are out there, we just, you know, we're afraid to say you lost the game. We're afraid to say you got an F and your teacher called. Or we're just sort of afraid of what somehow this reaction is going to create. And now we're dealing with a generation that just might be crippled. You know, that deserves some attention.
I think I agree with a lot with what you said. I also grew up in a military home, so I recognize that kind of orderliness and expectation without a pat on the back. You know, doing good wasn't considered good. It was considered that's what you would do.
Right.
One of the things about self-esteem based on academic achievement is that it makes a person extremely vulnerable, because you're always coming up against a new challenge. So if you base it upon just total success in academic, you're just going to go, it's ebb and flow. You know, and I've been thinking about the self-esteem thing as being something close to narcissism, I think you should drop it. Just leave it alone, move on, and then try to do, good in the world. I think if you do good for other people, I think you get a sense of what self-esteem is. And therefore you feel better about yourself. And you lose the self. You lose it, and you're challenging, you see other people's struggles, and that actually, I think, encourages you to try to do better and to try harder. And my dad, if he said, good job, I was like, he never said good job. As far as I know, I've never done a good job. But I did what I was told. And, it's just the way he was. So.
Don't you think, too, that self-esteem is like so many other characteristics, personality characteristics? It's generated and developed in the first 4 to 5 years of life. Children are so vulnerable to whatever you say to them. You're their gods. If you're the parents, you're there. Hopefully you'll be there. We talked about that before, Bryan. But isn't that kind of thing developed early on, so that whether it doesn't come from academic achievement, it comes from the internal drives, the internal strengths that are imparted to children by all their environment and by their by the parenting.
I've often thought that we're all born with it, and parents can only take it away.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think it can be taken away. If we tell somebody they're no good, if we tell them you can't do this, to me that was always a challenge. Don't tell me I can't do something, because I will then try to go out and do it. But so I think there's kind of a fine line there. While you don't want to over compliment a child and give them too much, you don't want to debase them as well.
I've seen that.
What you need to do, I think, is to encourage, whether it be a student or a child, to do the right things, to try harder. If it's in that classroom, you want to encourage the student to try the problem. And they may fail, and it's okay. You didn't get that, but we're going to keep trying. And that does more to build that self-esteem than saying you're brilliant, you're the best student I've ever seen, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think it goes to grit.
Yeah.
It's being able to pick yourself up.
Hard work.
Knowing that you did your best, and to go at it again. To really work hard, and that inner drive. And I feel the same way as Patty. When someone says, I don't think you can do this, well, that sets in motion to me, well, I'm just going to show them that, that I can do that. But
that's if you've got the grit.
If you have the grit.
And that's tough.
If you have the grit.
That's tough sometimes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
One of the worst challenges in my working life was facing the annual performance review. I knew what I had done that year. I knew where I had succeeded. I knew where I failed. And the problem was convincing the supervisors of that.
I tell you what, that was not the supervisor's best day either.
No, I'm sure it wasn't. That wasn't my case when I've had to do the same thing with my subordinates.
When you think about it, though, think that we're all born with a high level of self-esteem, and it can only be taken away. And then at some point, some genius decided we're going to teach self-esteem. I mean, can self-esteem be taught? Yeah, can you put it back?
I think and Bryan mentioned this, I think you overuse it then. And people don't gain that back, just by simply praising. I mean, you mentioned just giving something to someone and not having earned it. Right. And you don't learn self-esteem in that way.
I have an idea that this all started with some PhD's thesis that decided that somehow people with high self-esteem learned better than people with low self-esteem, and then tried to figure out a way to
correlation of 0.2 to get accepted.
Forget the causation part. It's the correlation part, and it does correlate well. You look at a bunch of good students, and your chances are they've got high level of self-esteem. But where did it come from? Being a good student?
But rather than teaching self-esteem, you're taking away that idea of obligation, which you both referred to.
I think also with the self-esteem thing, it's like it makes logical sense. If I feel good about myself, I'm always going to do better. That's not always true. When I feel challenged, or when I feel You said I couldn't do it, so I'm going to prove something. I think when you're like the stone in a creek, makes the water run faster, and it has to overcome that obstacle. I think we don't think of it that way, but it may be the truth of what life is all about. As we go through it, we overcome obstacles all the time.
And there's hard work behind that. Just telling somebody you're great doesn't make you great. You have to work to that point, and that goes back to
But
that
you see,
obligation.
that's the way it all started. People got silly. I read about programs where the classroom would start the day by everybody chanting, "I am special." I am special. And they would
Like a Japanese factory.
Yeah. That never happened when I was growing up.
Not at my house. No.
But
I went to
doing it with with posters on the wall talking about how significant I am and the world couldn't live without me and so forth, and it leads to, I would think, narcissism. After a while, you'd get very, very concerned about it. But I'm wondering, can you teach it? Now, people have low self-esteem for a lot of reasons. They're obese, they're a minority, they're picked on for one reason or another. They're a top student, they'll get picked on. You can damage people's self-esteem in a lot of ways, I think. But the whole idea of trying to teach it, and if you could, does it help? And I think we're probably agreeing that it doesn't.
I think in the environment of a classroom, self-esteem is learned, whether or not that teacher is actually teaching self-esteem, but that student is learning the components of self-esteem. They just might not know it.
Yeah.
That's right.
That they're actually in an environment where there's an expectation, and that teacher is there helping them, or the parent, and they're learning it with without them even knowing it.
Okay.
So.
Well, listen, thank you very much for another very thoughtful discussion. It's been a delight, and we could probably go on for another half hour or so. And I want to thank everybody who is joining us for this discussion, and ask for a favor. We'd like you to suggest future topics. This is our 20th program, and we'd like to have a lot more programs, but if you can come up with an idea that you'd like to see discussed, please contact us at John Grom at ribrom@aol.com, RIBROM. Don't ask me where that came from, but please email me your ideas. And I'd like to leave with this quote from my favorite poet, Robert Frost. "Education is the ability to listen to almost anything without losing your temper or self-confidence." Thank you.